This happened about 3 years ago. I was 32 years old at the time and I was recently divorced. Even though the breakup was tough, I was still on good terms with my ex-wife. That's why I decided to go to her wedding, which she invited me to. It was in a small town about 4 hours away from where I was living. I'm not big on driving, mostly because I work from home and don't really need to. I'd sold my own car a while back, so when I do have to drive, it's usually in a rental. I'm not great with directions either, so I was relying on the map on the phone. I didn't have a GPS setup or dashboard screen, just the phone. I got the rental early in the morning and set off. Before going to the highway, I pulled into a gas station, filled up the car, and studied the map on my phone for a few minutes. It was pretty simple, but every so often I'd pull over to check where I was supposed to go next. The wedding was nice. It was a small gathering at a banquet hall in the country. I knew a few people there, mostly through my ex, and we all made polite conversation, although it was awkward at times. She seemed happy though, and that was good enough for me. I'd been there long enough to eat and watch the first dance, but I decided to head back early. It was already dark by then, and I'm not a big fan of night driving, but I figured I'd be fine. On the way back, I ran into signal issues. My phone's map app kept freezing or refusing to load. It worked just fine on the drive up, so I was expecting the same on the way back. But after 20 minutes of guessing, it turns and hoping I was still on the highway, I decided to pull into a rest stop. It was after midnight, and the lot was almost empty, except for a few trucks parked along the far edge. I parked under one of the streetlights near the bathroom, and the light flooded in through my back window. The glow from my phone. The screen felt harsh compared to the darkness outside. I tried reloading the map, tapping the screen, and watching that little loading wheel spin like it was stuck. I leaned back in the driver's seat, letting out a slow breath and waiting for it to show up. At the time, I wasn't sure if I was lost, but I really didn't want to guess at where I was going. I'd been sitting there for maybe 5 minutes when I heard a soft tap on the passenger side window. It was so light that at first I wasn't even sure I'd heard it. I glanced over expecting to see one, but there was nothing there. I squinted through the glass, leaning forward a bit to get a better look. Still nothing, but with the lights on in my car, it was hard to see much outside at all. I figured maybe something had fallen from one of the trees near the edge of the lot. I went back to the phone, tapping the screen again to try and get the map to load. A few seconds later, I heard another tap. This time, 2 sharp, hard knocks on the back window. It was louder than before, and it came from behind me. I turned around expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. I'm not the person who jumps to conclusions, but that's the thing that's hard to explain away. I sat still for a second, gripping the steering wheel tight. My eyes darted from the side mirrors to the rear view, trying to spot any sign of a person. The big rigs at the edge of the lot weren't moving. Their cabs were dark, no headlights on, no sign of life. I scanned the area again, looking at the line of trees behind the lot. Again, nothing stood out. I'm not sure how long I sat there, but it was long enough. I'm not one to panic, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't on edge. I'd seen enough news stories to know. This was the part where something bad usually happens. I'd had enough. I shifted to drive and backed out of the spot. As soon as the car rolled back a foot, I felt a hard bump. Wasn't like hitting a curb or a pothole. It was softer but big enough to jolt the car. I slammed on the brakes and my heart felt like it stopped along with the car. For a second I sat frozen, trying to figure out what I'd hit. Then I heard a low, strained groaning coming from under the car. I reached for the door handle, then opened it just enough to lean out. I looked down and saw a man. He was half under my car with one hand pressed to the ground, like he was trying to push himself up. I closed the door and locked it. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I hit 911 and put it on speaker. I told the dispatcher where I was and what had happened. "There's a man under my car," I said. "I think I ran him over." She asked if the man was still there and if he was conscious. I glanced down through the window. He'd managed to get his head and one arm free, but wasn't standing up. He was just lying there. The first officer showed up in less than 10 minutes. I stayed in the car with the doors locked the whole time. When the officer pulled in, I finally got out. I tried to explain everything, but I'm not sure I made much sense. The officer kept calm and told me to take a breath and walk him through it step by step. While we talked, more police cars and an ambulance arrived. Two EMTs crouched down by the man and checked him over. They loaded him onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. One of the officers pulled me inside and said, "Don't worry, you're not in trouble. We've got it on record that you called it in right away." I nodded but didn't say much else. A couple of days later, I got a call from the police department. Turns out he'd been carrying an illegal gun. He had a criminal record too, including robbery and assault, stuff like that. The officer on the phone said, "Looks like he was trying to get you to step out of the car." I didn't know what to say to that. The whole thing stayed with me for a while. I'd replay it in my head over and over again. If I'd gotten out of the car that first time, I'm pretty sure it would have gone a lot differently. I'm not much for what-ifs, but that one's hard to shake. I've rented cars since then, but never had anything happen like this. 20s. This was before I went to college. And I was actually a high school dropout at the time. My parents had kicked me out, and I was working 2 full-time jobs just to get by. I was a cashier during the day, and I did nights as a security guard. I'd get sent to different locations depending on the shift, which was inconvenient. One night I had a long drive ahead of me to cover for someone. It was at a site I'd never been to before. It was about 1 a.m. on a Wednesday, so the roads were mostly empty. No surprise there. I'd driven a good stretch of highway without seeing another car. Then I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. They were far back at first, but kept getting closer. After a few minutes, they were right on my bumper. And I could tell that it was a pickup truck. The lights were way too bright. It was like they had their high beams on. I'd driven enough to know that's either someone being careless or someone being rude. Either way, it was annoying. I switched lanes to let them pass, figuring that's all they wanted. But instead of going around me, they switched lanes too, staying right on my tail. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, squinting at the glare. They backed off a little, but stayed locked on me. I've had drivers tailgate me before, but something about the way this guy moved lanes with me rubbed me the wrong way. I told myself they'd probably just pass me eventually. But minutes went by and that didn't happen. I'd been on the road for about 30 minutes when it started to feel less like an annoyance and more like a problem. They weren't honking or anything, just following. I tried telling myself it was probably some teenager messing around. But that logic only works for so long. I thought about pulling over, but I'd seen enough shows to know that's a bad idea. I was getting irritated and, to be honest, a little scared. I'm not the kind to play games on the road, but this wasn't normal. I pressed the gas a little, thinking I'd put some distance between us. But the truck sped up too. The lights were so bright, I had to tilt the rear-view mirror to avoid being blinded. I moved back into the right lane, hoping they'd finally go around, but they stayed back there. I'm not proud of it, but I tapped my brakes lightly. Not hard enough to stop, just enough to flash the lights and maybe send a message. It's not something I usually do, but I'd had enough. They didn't back off, though. If anything, they seemed to get closer. I glanced up again, squinting through the glare. I was trying to see if I could make out the driver's face, but I couldn't see anyone, just with the outline of the truck's cab behind the lights. Then I saw an exit coming up and decided I'd take it. It wasn't part of my route, but I figured it to be better than dealing with this driver. I turned on my blinker and took the exit. Not surprisingly, the truck followed. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. The road off the highway led into a small town which was made up of empty streets and closed-up shops. I took a ride at the first light, then another turn a few blocks down. I kept checking my rear view, and for a second I thought I'd lost them. But as I turned onto a side street, the same headlights appear behind me, slowly rounding the corner. I've been driving in circles for a few minutes, and I knew I couldn't keep doing that forever. My phone was in the passenger seat, and I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to stop moving. Every turn I took, the truck followed, always at a steady distance. Then I decided to head toward a gas station I'd seen a couple of blocks back. It'd be lit up and maybe there'd be people around. I pulled in and parked right by the front entrance. If they wanted to keep following me, they'd have to do it under the lights and on camera. The truck didn't pull into the lot. Instead, it slowed down as it drove past. I watched it roll by, eyes locked on it the whole time. For a second, I thought maybe they'd finally had enough. But then just past the gas station's edge, it stopped. It didn't turn around, didn't drive away, just sat there, idling at the side of the road with the headlights still on. I sat there and watched for a while. Then the truck's headlights suddenly went off. I'm not sure why that made it feel worse, but it did. My eyes stayed on that spot by the road, watching for any movement. I'm not sure how long I sat there, but eventually, I decided to leave the parking lot. On my way out, I passed the truck one more time. Out of curiosity, I looked in through the windshield, but it was completely empty. I'm sure that nobody got out because I was watching the whole time. That was when I was sure it was somebody messing with me. It was probably some teenagers doing a prank. But it's pretty dangerous to chase someone around with high beams on. I could have been killed. One of my best friends is Ryan, and he lived way out in the boonies when we were growing up. It was about a 45-minute drive from my parents' place, most of which was along a dirt road with no streetlights. Just miles of woods on either side. Me and our friend Josh went to Ryan's house one night to hang out. We planned to stay over, but things didn't go as planned. The night started off fine, but after a while, Josh and Ryan started to argue. It started with small jabs and sarcastic remarks, but it built up until Ryan and Josh were screaming at each other. I'd seen them argue before, but this time it didn't blow over. Josh finally said he'd had enough and told me we should leave. It was already around 2 a.m., and I figured getting out of there was the best option. The two of them had been drinking, but luckily, I was sober so I could drive. We got into my car and started down the long dirt road. It was a dark night and the only light came from my headlights. The road felt rougher than usual with every bump rattling the car. I was tired but focused, keeping my eyes on the narrow path ahead. After about 10 minutes of driving, I saw someone walking on the side of the road. Caught me off guard because there's nothing out there. Not many houses and no stores or businesses. He was moving slowly, head down, wearing a dark jacket with a hood up. As my headlights hit him, he lifted his head and looked right at me. His face was blank, like he was just watching me pass by. It was strange and I didn't stop. People walking on that road in the middle of the night aren't usually people you want to meet. I glanced over at Josh, but he didn't say anything. He had his arms crossed, staring straight ahead. He was still a bit grumpy from the argument with Ryan. The person then faded into the darkness behind us. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel the tension growing in the car. Josh was quiet, and I could tell he was still thinking about the argument with Ryan, replaying it in his head. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start another fight. I just wanted to get home. We drove in silence for a while longer. Then Josh started arguing with me. Without getting into the details, he thought I had taken Ryan's side in the earlier fight. After a bit of immature bickering, Josh told me to pull over. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. "I'll walk," he said. I tried to tell him it was a dumb idea, but he wasn't hearing it. I pulled over thinking he'd come to his senses after a minute or two, but he didn't. He got out and started walking down the road. I sat there for a bit, watching him go. I thought about driving after him, but I'd seen him do this before. He'd walk for a few minutes, then calm down. I decided to drive ahead a little and wait for him to catch up. I'd barely driven 5 minutes when I lost sight of him around a bend. Figured I'd stop up ahead and give him time to cool off. I glanced on my phone to see if he'd texted me, but there was nothing. I checked for a call, but still nothing. I decided that I'd wait a little longer before calling him myself. Then my phone rang and it was Josh. I picked up, expecting him to say he'd cooled off and wanted a ride, but it was more than that. His voice was frantic, and he was breathing hard like he'd just sprinted. "Come back," he said. "Come back now." His voice was shaking, and it sounded like he was on the verge of crying. I didn't ask questions. I just turned around. I drove back fast. My headlights carved through the darkness, but everything outside that beam was pitch black. I kept looking for Josh, but he wasn't where I'd left him. I drove slowly and my eyes were darting around. Then I spotted him up ahead, standing in the middle of the road. His jacket sleeve was torn, and he was holding one arm close to his side. I pulled up next to him and he climbed into the car. As soon as I saw him, I noticed that he was covered in blood. It was smeared on his arm, soaking his sleeve. It wasn't just a little cut. It looked like he'd been in a fight. "What happened?" I asked, driving forward slowly. He didn't answer right away. His head was down and he was still breathing hard. "I think I killed him," he finally gasped. I glanced over at him, trying to process what he just said. "Killed who?" Josh ran a hand over his face. He looked exhausted and shaken. "He grabbed me," he said quietly. I fought back. "I picked up a rock and hit him." His voice cracked a little. "I hit him a lot." I didn't know what to say. I kept arriving, glancing at him every few seconds. "Did he get up?" I finally asked. "I don't know," Josh said. He was staring out the window now, his eyes locked on the woods. We didn't go back. I drove straight to the nearest gas station and called the cops. Then we sat in the car waiting for them to arrive. Josh didn't say much and I didn't push him. He sat with his head down, staring at his hands. And I didn't know what else to do but wait. When the cops showed up, they talked to both of us. We told them about the guy on the road and how Josh had been attacked. They asked if we could show them where it happened. But we told them it was hard to know exactly where on that long, dark road. They searched the area and came back with nothing. No signs of a fight, no blood, and no body. The cops told us they'd file a report and let us know if anything turned up. But nobody called. Days passed, then weeks, and nobody reported a missing person. The cops never contacted us again. Chances are that Josh hadn't hurt the guy as bad as he thought. He must have gotten away and never reported what happened. Either that or there's a dead guy out there in the woods waiting to be discovered.